Under the suffocating dark of the North African desert, a convoy of British jeeps glides silently across the sand. The year is 1942. Their engines are muffled, their headlights blacked out. Each man grips his weapon, knowing what's ahead could easily be his last fight. At the front sits a tall, quiet figure, Major David Stirling, the architect of a new kind of warfare. His men aren't ordinary soldiers. They're part of a secret experiment the British Army barely understands. Their mission tonight? To drive straight into a heavily guarded German airfield and destroy the heart of the Luftwaffe. No reinforcements, no escape route, just 18 jeeps, 70 commandos, and the endless desert night. What follows would redefine how wars were fought and how legends were born. Because when the engines finally roared to life and the tracer rounds lit the sky, the world witnessed the birth of something extraordinary. The Special Air Service. If stories of courage under fire and impossible missions keep you on the edge of your seat, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves military history as much as you do. Your support helps us bring more incredible true war stories to life, one mission at a time. The desert at night feels almost alien, a vast black ocean of sand and silence. In July 1942, that emptiness hides something extraordinary. 18 jeeps moving in single file, their engines barely whispering against the wind. Each driver knows that a single spark, a glint of metal, could mean death. At the head of the convoy sits Major David Stirling, tall, calm, and utterly focused. He's leading a new kind of soldier into a new kind of war. These men aren't marching in neat lines or digging trenches. They're ghosting through the desert, invisible, unpredictable, and dangerous. Somewhere ahead lies a German air base brimming with bombers that have been hammering British troops for weeks. If this mission succeeds, hundreds of those aircraft will burn. If it fails, none of these men will live to see dawn. It hadn't always been like this. Just a year earlier, Stirling was a restless officer, brilliant, reckless, and endlessly frustrated by the slow machinery of traditional warfare. The desert campaign was bleeding the British dry. Convoys were shredded by Luftwaffe raids, supply lines cut, morale crushed. Stirling believed he had an answer. Small teams of hand-picked men dropped deep behind enemy lines to strike swiftly and vanish before anyone could react. It was a plan so audacious, it bordered on madness. And that's exactly why it worked. In the beginning, almost no one believed in him. Senior officers called it suicide, but a handful of men, misfits and adventurers at heart, signed up anyway. They weren't polished or parade-ready. They were tough, independent, and above all, willing to die if it meant changing the tide of the war. Now, as the jeeps crawl across the endless sand, that theory is being put to the ultimate test. The desert stretches for miles in every direction. No landmarks, no mercy. Even the stars seem sharper here, stabbing down like cold needles of light. The men whisper quietly, checking their twin-mounted Vickers K guns, feeling the sweat cling beneath their helmets. They know the odds. 18 jeeps against an entire German airfield, hundreds of soldiers, armed to the teeth, waiting just beyond the horizon. But there's a strange calm among them, a kind of fatalistic confidence. They trust Stirling, and they trust each other. "Who dares wins," someone mutters, half motto, half prayer. The words hang in the dry air, swallowed by the wind. Ahead, a faint glimmer flickers across the sand, the glow of runway lights. The target is close. Then, as if the desert itself is holding its breath, the night comes alive. The sound of an aircraft engine slices through the silence. Stirling freezes. For a split second, he thinks they've been spotted. But then, through the gloom, he sees the unmistakable shape of a Luftwaffe transport plane coming into land. The airfield is right there, closer than anyone imagined. Stirling's pulse quickens. This is it. No turning back now. He raises his hand, signaling to the others. The men tense. The jeeps line up, engines rumbling softly like caged animals. Stirling takes one last look across the dark expanse, the men, the guns, the impossible mission ahead, and gives the only order that matters. Time to go to work. It all began not in the desert, but in frustration. In 1941, Major David Stirling wasn't yet a legend. He was just another restless officer watching opportunity slip through Britain's fingers. The North African campaign was a brutal grind. Every attempt to outmaneuver Rommel's Africa Corps seemed to end the same way, with convoys bombed, soldiers stranded, and morale sinking fast. Stirling, tall and slightly awkward, had never fit neatly into the Army's rigid structure. He believed in something different, that war didn't have to be about numbers or brute strength. It could be about surprise, deception, and speed. "Why send 1,000 men," he once said, "when 12 could do the job better if they hit hard and vanished before the enemy could react?" It was a radical thought for its time, and to most generals, pure nonsense. But Stirling had something the bureaucrats didn't: imagination. He envisioned small, hand-picked units capable of infiltrating deep behind enemy lines, not to hold ground, but to wreak havoc. Destroy aircraft, fuel dumps, supply depots, then disappear into the sand before anyone knew what had happened. It was warfare stripped to its most dangerous essence: fast, surgical, psychological. He started gathering like-minded men, rebels, athletes, rogues, and idealists who craved something beyond the monotony of conventional fighting. Among them were Paddy Mayne, a former rugby star with a volcanic temper and unmatched courage, and Jock Lewis, an Oxford scholar whose invention, the Lewis bomb, would soon become the unit's calling card. Together they trained in secrecy, parachuting at night, driving through sandstorms, and learning how to survive where even the desert seemed hostile. When Stirling first pitched his plan to hire command, they practically laughed him out of the room. But fate, as it often does, intervened in the strangest way. During one reckless attempt to push his proposal, Stirling slipped past security at Cairo headquarters, literally crawling under a fence, and stormed into the office of General Neil Ritchie. Instead of arresting him, Ritchie listened. Maybe it was Stirling's audacity, or the sheer desperation of the war, but the general gave him a chance. He authorized the formation of a small L detachment, a cover name meant to make the Germans think a whole new airborne division was forming. In truth, it was just a handful of men, a few trucks, and an idea. But it was enough. The SAS was born, though no one yet called it that. Their first mission was a disaster. A parachute raid behind enemy lines ended with men scattered across the desert, lost to sandstorms and gunfire. Many never returned. Stirling could have given up. Most men would have. But instead, he adapted. If the desert couldn't be tamed by parachute, it would be conquered by jeep. Working with the long-range desert group, Stirling turned his ragged survivors into desert raiders, masters of hit-and-run warfare. They painted their jeeps dark to blend with the night, bolted twin Vickers K machine guns to the front, and learned to navigate by the stars. What had started as one man's reckless idea was slowly becoming something far greater, a revolution in how wars would be fought. Out there, in the endless sand and silence, a legend was beginning to take shape, one that would soon drive straight into the heart of a German airbase. By the summer of 1942, Stirling's L detachment had evolved from a reckless idea into a hardened brotherhood. They'd learned every trick the desert could teach: how to find direction by the stars, how to dig into the sand for shelter during air raids, even how to move silently across dunes where one wrong step could give away a position. Now Stirling had something new in mind, an assault that would strike the German war machine where it hurt most: on the ground. Their target was an airfield used by the Luftwaffe to launch daily attacks on British positions. 18 jeeps, 70 men, and a plan that read more like a death sentence than an order. But that was the SAS way. Small numbers, impossible odds, and absolute commitment. When Stirling gathered his men around the flickering light of a desert lantern to outline the mission, there was no hesitation. They didn't ask if it could be done, only when. Preparation became obsession. Mechanics stripped the jeeps down to their bare frames, removing every ounce of unnecessary weight. Each one was modified with twin Vickers K machine guns mounted front and rear, weapons capable of spitting out 200 rounds a minute. The men stockpiled ammunition, flares, rations, and water, knowing full well that if they ran out, there would be no resupply, no rescue. At night, they practiced driving in total darkness, headlights blacked out, relying only on the faint glow of the jeep ahead. The desert tested them relentlessly. Engines choked on sand, tires shredded on jagged rock and the heat-warped metal. But the men grew tougher, leaner, more synchronized. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a single, moving organism, a living weapon built from courage, instinct, and defiance. There was tension, of course. Even among the bravest, doubt creeps in before a mission like this. Paddy Mayne, Stirling's fiery second-in-command, walked among the jeeps before departure, checking weapons with a calm intensity that bordered on ritual. "If this goes wrong," one of the younger troopers whispered, "we'll never make it out." Mayne just smiled, a quiet, dangerous grin, and said, "Then we'll make sure it doesn't go wrong." For men like him, fear was fuel. They thrived on it. As dawn crept over the horizon, the convoy rolled out, engines rumbling softly beneath a canvas of pale light. From a distance, it looked like a mirage, a line of dark shapes gliding silently into nothingness. They traveled for hours, days even, across the endless expanse of sand and heat. Landmarks were scarce, and the desert gave no mercy. The men learned to recognize each other's silhouettes against the starlight, to navigate by instinct more than compass. The silence was eerie, no birds, no wind, just the hum of engines and the crunch of tires on hard-packed sand. Each mile brought them deeper into enemy territory, closer to a point of no return. At night, when the engines finally cooled and the world fell still, the men would lie under the stars, rifles across their chests, staring up at the sky. Somewhere out there across the dunes was their target, a German airfield pulsing with life, fuel, and firepower. Soon those same planes would burn. And as Stirling gazed into the dark horizon, he murmured the words that had become the unit's creed. "Who dares wins." By the time the convoy was within striking distance, the desert had stripped the men down to their essence. Sweat burned their eyes, lips cracked from thirst, and every muscle ached from days of driving through a landscape that seemed endless and hostile. Navigation wasn't just difficult, it was life or death. With no landmarks to rely on, their navigator, Lieutenant Jock Lewis's replacement, used nothing but a compass, instinct, and the stars. Even the most seasoned men began to doubt. Had they gone too far north? Were they circling aimlessly in a sea of sand? Stirling said little. His focus never wavered, but the tension in his jaw said enough. Somewhere out there, beyond that endless horizon, lay a German airbase full of bombers ready to strike British forces. Finding it was the difference between victory and vanishing forever. The deeper they pushed, the more treacherous the terrain became. The jeeps groaned over dunes and loose gravel, engines coughing in protest. The men barely spoke. They'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, running on adrenaline and stubborn will. Then, as night fell once again, the horizon shimmered, faint glimmers of light flickering in the distance. At first, they thought it was a mirage, another cruel trick of the desert. But then one of the men whispered, "Runway lights." Every heart in the convoy seemed to skip a beat. They'd found it, or it had found them. Stirling ordered the engines cut. The jeeps rolled to a silent halt. The only sound was the crackle of cooling metal and the faint hiss of the wind through the dunes. Through his field glasses, Stirling scanned the horizon. There it was, the airfield, sitting like a jewel of light in the darkness, its runway glowing softly as German mechanics moved around the planes. He could see silhouettes of Ju-52 transport aircraft, Stuka dive bombers, and Bf-109 fighters, the very machines that had terrorized British convoys for months. His men crouched low, eyes fixed on the target. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to hold still. The desert was silent, but under that stillness was something electric, the hum of fate before collision. Stirling's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his map, double-checking their coordinates. Every calculation pointed to one conclusion. This was it, the objective, the point of no return. And then, the sound that changed everything. A deep, rolling roar echoed through the air. Engines. One of the men jerked his head up just in time to see a Luftwaffe plane descending toward the runway, its landing lights slicing through the dark. For an instant, Stirling's stomach dropped. Were they discovered? Were those engines coming for them? But as the plane lowered, it became clear. The Germans had no idea the SAS were there. They were landing right in front of them, right into the jaws of an ambush. Stirling turned to his men, his face illuminated by the faint green glow of the desert flare gun in his hand. He whispered the words they'd been waiting for. Time to go to work. Engines growled to life and the convoy rolled forward, silent no longer, but roaring toward history. The first burst of gunfire shattered the desert silence like a lightning strike. From the moment Stirling raised his hand and gave the order, chaos exploded in every direction. The jeeps surged forward, engines roaring, sand spraying in great arcs behind them. At 800 meters out, the convoy tightened into formation, Stirling in the center, Paddy Mayne and the French on either flank. Then, all at once, the darkness erupted into a wall of red and white tracers. The twin Vickers K guns unleashed their fury, 68 barrels hammering out a storm of fire. To the Germans on the ground, it must have looked like the end of the world. Streaks of burning light cutting through the night, bullets tearing through fuel tanks, wings, and engines. A Ju-52 caught fire and blossomed into a ball of flame. The air smelled of burning fuel and scorched metal, a violent symphony of destruction echoing across the dunes. Inside the jeeps, there was no time to think. The gunners screamed over the roar of the engines, firing in every direction as sparks rained down on them. The recoil from the Vickers shook the vehicles violently, each shot feeling like a punch to the chest. Stirling's voice cut through the noise. "Keep moving," as he waved them toward the runway. The line of jeeps crashed through the perimeter fence and rolled straight onto the airfield. Under the ghostly green light of Stirling's flare, they split into two columns, tearing down the tarmac at a crawl, strafing parked aircraft as they went. Every plane they passed, Stukas, Messerschmitts, Junkers, turned into scrap within seconds. Explosions rolled down the runway like thunder. One German pilot tried to start his plane, desperate to escape, but before he could lift off, a line of bullets stitched across his cockpit, ending it before it began. For the defenders, it was sheer panic. The airfield's lights blinked out as shouts and sirens filled the night. German ground crews scrambled for cover, some diving under the very planes that were now turning into fireballs. Those who grabbed weapons fought blindly, firing into the dark, unable to see who or what was attacking them. A few managed to set up a 20mm Breda anti-aircraft gun and opened fire, tracer rounds slicing past the jeeps. One shell slammed into a vehicle near Stirling, blowing it apart and hurling debris into the air. Trooper John Robson, one of the youngest in the unit, took a hit and collapsed over his gun, lifeless. Stirling's jaw clenched, but there was no time to stop. "Keep going!" he shouted, voice raw from the smoke and the dust. Every instinct screamed to press forward, to finish the job before the enemy could regroup. By the time they reached the end of the taxiway, the airfield was unrecognizable. Flames climbed high into the night, turning the sky red. Dozens of Luftwaffe aircraft burned, ammunition stores erupted in secondary explosions, and the once orderly base had become a sea of wreckage. Stirling honked his horn, a prearranged signal, and the jeeps slowed to a halt. Engines idled. For the first time in minutes, there was silence, broken only by the distant crackle of fire and the groans of collapsing metal. Stirling stood up in his seat and looked around, his face smeared with soot and sand. "Everyone okay?" he called. A few voices answered, "Oui! Still breathing!" Robson was gone, but the rest were alive, battered, deafened, but alive. Stirling exhaled hard, a ghost of a smile forming beneath the grime. The mission wasn't over yet, but the message was clear. A handful of men in jeeps had just turned one of the Luftwaffe's proudest airfields into a smoking graveyard. The airfield was burning like a city on fire, the flames licking the night sky in shades of orange and red. But as the SAS roared through the wreckage, the Germans began to recover from their shock. Somewhere on the far side of the base, a 20mm Breda gun barked to life again, spitting tracer rounds that ripped through the smoke. Mortars began to whistle overhead, thudding into the sand dangerously close to the jeeps. Stirling's men ducked low, eyes squinting against the glare. A shell exploded to their right, flipping a jeep onto its side and showering the others with dirt and shrapnel. The convoy jolted but didn't break formation. They'd expected this. The desert didn't allow clean victories. Stirling's voice rose above the noise. "Find that gun and take it out!" Sergeant Johnny Cooper swung his jeep around, twin Vickers blazing as he zeroed in on the flashes from the German position. The firefight that followed was brutal and chaotic. The jeeps darted between the wrecks of burning aircraft, firing in short, furious bursts. The German gunners fought back hard, their shots lighting up the darkness like lightning strikes. One round slammed through Stirling's own jeep, missing his knees by inches. The vehicle shuddered to a stop, engine dead. "Why won't it go?" he shouted. "We haven't got an engine," came the reply. Another jeep screeched to a halt beside him, Robson's jeep, the one now driven by a man with blood still on his hands from pulling his friend's body off the gun. Stirling climbed aboard without a word. Around them, mortars kept falling, shaking the ground so violently it felt like the desert itself was shuddering in pain. But Cooper's aim was true. A short, savage burst from his guns silenced the Breda once and for all. The men cheered, not with joy, but with the grim relief of survivors. When the last enemy gun fell quiet, Stirling ordered the convoy to stop. "Switch off!" he yelled, and one by one the jeeps went silent. The sudden stillness was eerie, the kind that makes you aware of every breath. Flames crackled, metal hissed, and in that red glow the men could finally see what they'd done. Dozens of aircraft, the pride of the Luftwaffe, lay in smoldering heaps. Fuel drums burned like torches, sending oily smoke curling into the stars. The German defenders had either fled or fallen. Stirling stood among his men, eyes scanning the faces illuminated by firelight. They'd lost one of their own, but compared to the destruction around them, it was a miracle they were still standing. "Ammo check," he called. Replies came back. "Half drum." "One left. 2 drums. Enough for one last run." Stirling nodded slowly. "Then we finish it," he said. "No half measures." Engines rumbled again as the jeeps rolled forward for a final sweep across the field. They passed burning wrecks, shooting out the last few planes that remained intact. The night was a blur of heat, gunfire, and roaring engines. Paddy Main, ever the wild card, spotted a lone Jew 52 still untouched and leapt from his jeep with a bomb in hand. "Paddy!" someone shouted, but he was already sprinting across the tarmac. He slapped the charge onto the plane's wing, ran back, and dove into his seat as the explosion thundered behind him. The transport went up in flames, sparks raining over the fleeing jeeps. That was the signal, the end of the raid. Stirling fired a red flare into the sky, its glow painting the desert blood red. One by one, the jeeps turned toward the dunes and vanished into the darkness, engines fading beneath the roar of the burning airfield. Behind them, the German base was no longer an airfield. It was a graveyard lit by fire. By the time the SAS disappeared into the dunes, the desert had swallowed all traces of the battle, except for the glow behind them. The horizon burned like a sunrise that wouldn't fade, the German airfield still erupting in bursts of orange and smoke. Stirling and his men drove hard through the night, navigating by instinct more than compass. The adrenaline that had carried them through the assault now began to ebb, leaving only exhaustion and silence. Each man stared ahead, eyes dry, faces coated in a layer of sand and soot. They had done what no one believed possible, destroyed a German base deep behind enemy lines. But victory in the desert was never clean. The deeper they drove, the heavier the weight became. The silence between the engines was filled with the unspoken. The image of John Robson slumped over his gun, the roar of planes dying in fire. In war, even triumph carries ghosts. As dawn broke, the desert turned cruel again. The temperature climbed fast, the horizon shimmered, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. The jeeps rattled across uneven ground, tires tearing over jagged rock. Fuel was low, water almost gone. A single mechanical failure could mean death, not from bullets, but from thirst. Still, Stirling refused to stop. "Keep moving," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The plan was to regroup at a rendezvous point hundreds of miles away, where supplies and friendly units would meet them. But the desert had other ideas. Sandstorms rolled in without warning, blotting out the sun and swallowing landmarks. When the dust cleared, they realized they'd drifted off course. No radio contact, no sign of the others, just a burning sun and the endless, mocking emptiness of the Sahara. For 2 days, the convoy crawled through the wasteland. Men rationed water to a sip an hour. Lips bled, minds wandered. The desert had a way of whispering doubts into a man's ear. And in that silence, even the toughest began to wonder if they'd traded one death for another. Stirling's leadership was the only thing holding the line. He never showed fear, never slowed, even when exhaustion carved deep lines into his face. At one point, a tire burst, forcing the men to abandon a jeep and cram into the others. Still, they pressed on, each mile feeling heavier than the last. They'd survived machine guns, mortars, and fire, but now the enemy was invisible, patient, and absolute. The desert itself. When hope was nearly gone, fate offered one last test. The men crested a ridge and found themselves staring down a steep escarpment, a wall of sand and rock that seemed impossible to descend. The navigator climbed out to scout, disappearing over the edge. For a moment, no one moved. Then a shout, distant, frantic, but full of life. "We made it!" he screamed, waving both arms. Below, tucked into a natural hollow, were British jeeps, their rendezvous team. The men cheered, voices cracking with relief. Stirling's convoy rolled down carefully, engines sputtering, hearts pounding. They'd made it back. But as they reached the camp, laughter and joy gave way to quiet reflection. The desert had taken its toll. Robson was gone, the French were missing, and somewhere out there, Paddy Mayne and his men were still fighting their way home. The mission was a success, but success in the desert always came at a price. While Stirling and his men clawed their way back to safety, the French detachment under aspirant André Zirnheld faced a very different fate. After the raid, they'd broken away from the main convoy, hoping to throw off pursuit and link up later at the rendezvous. But the desert, indifferent as ever, had other plans. Their jeeps rumbled through the night, engines coughing, the headlights off to avoid detection. When dawn came, they hid under the cover of a shallow ridge. 3 jeeps, a handful of men, and the crushing silence of the Sahara. The air shimmered with heat. They cooked what little food they had: tea, a few strips of dried meat, the first taste of calm in days. But as they ate, a low, distant sound rolled across the desert. At first it was faint, like thunder, then louder, the unmistakable drone of engines. Zernheld's head snapped up. "Aircraft," he whispered. Within moments, the calm turned to terror. 4 Stuka dive bombers appeared out of the sun, their silhouettes slicing through the light. The men froze, hoping to remain unseen, but the desert offers no cover, no mercy. The Stukas wheeled, diving low, and the first bombs hit the ridge like hammer blows. Sand and shrapnel erupted in every direction. "Take cover!" someone screamed, but there was nowhere to hide. The air filled with bullets and smoke as the German planes tore into them. A jeep exploded, flipping end over end before landing in flames. The others fired back blindly, their machine guns blazing into the sky, but the Stukas were too fast. One by one, the vehicles were shredded, their engines silenced. When the planes finally pulled away, the desert was littered with twisted metal, burning rubber, and the stillness of death. Zernheld was still alive. Barely. A mortar fragment had torn through his shoulder and stomach. His men lifted him into their last surviving jeep, racing across the sand as the sun began to sink. Every bump sent pain knifing through his body, but he refused to cry out. His second-in-command, François Martin, tried to comfort him, pressing a hand against the wound. Zernheld managed a faint smile. "Don't stop," he whispered. "We must reach them." But deep down, he knew he wouldn't. The horizon blurred, the colors fading into gold and red, the desert wind howling like an elegy. As night fell, the jeep lights flickered on the distant dunes, the rendezvous point just ahead. Zernheld stirred, his voice weak but clear. "I am going to leave you. I am at peace." Those were his last words. Moments later, the poet-warrior of the French SAS slipped quietly into eternity. When Martin and the survivors reached the camp, their faces told the story before words could. Stirling listened in silence, head bowed. Zernheld's body was laid out with care, his uniform cleaned of dust and blood. Among his belongings, Martin found a small notebook. Inside it, a poem written long before the raid. It was called The Paratrooper's Prayer. Its words spoke of courage, sacrifice, and serenity in the face of death. In time, that poem would become sacred to the French airborne forces. A tribute not only to Zernheld, but to every man who dared the impossible and paid the price. As the wind swept across the dunes, Stirling stood quietly, staring toward the horizon where the flames of the airfield still glowed faintly. The desert, it seemed, always demanded something in return. The desert had no compassion for the living. As Stirling's surviving jeeps rolled on, the horizon seemed to stretch forever, a vast, shimmering expanse that cared nothing for their courage or victory. They had succeeded in obliterating one of the Luftwaffe's key strongholds, but now came the second half of the battle: survival. Every mile home was a fight against exhaustion, dehydration, and the relentless sun. The men's faces were burned raw, their lips split, their uniforms stiff with sand and sweat. Stirling rode mostly in silence, his thoughts drifting between pride and loss. The mission had proved what he'd always believed, that small teams of daring men could change the course of a war, but at a cost that gnawed at him. For every plane they'd destroyed, a friend's life hung in the balance. Even in triumph, the desert whispered reminders of those who would never return. By the second day, their fuel was running dangerously low. One by one, jeeps began to falter, engines coughing, tires shredded. Stirling ordered the men to consolidate, abandoning what they couldn't save. Every gallon of petrol, every drop of water was precious now. The men moved slower, conserving what little strength they had left. The sun climbed higher, punishing them with merciless heat. The landscape rippled, turning mirages into cruel illusions, lakes that vanished, shadows that danced just out of reach. When night finally fell, they made camp in silence. No one spoke of the raid. The laughter and adrenaline of combat had long faded, replaced by the quiet endurance of soldiers who'd stared down death and were now bargaining for life. Paddy Mayne kept watch, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the dunes. Somewhere out there, German planes were searching, but in that darkness, the SAS had become ghosts once more. On the third day, the desert tried to break them. A sandstorm swept across their path. Not just wind, but a wall of dust so thick it felt like drowning on land. The jeeps slowed to a crawl. Men wrapped scarves across their faces, goggles crusted with grit. Communication was reduced to hand signals and shouted fragments lost to the storm. Hours passed in that suffocating blur until finally the wind began to die. When it cleared, they found themselves disoriented, off course again, and dangerously close to the limit of endurance. Stirling climbed atop a dune, scanning the horizon. Then, just as hope began to fade, he saw it. A faint column of smoke in the distance, rising steadily into the air. He raised a hand, pointing. "That's them," he said quietly. It was the rest of the SAS, Paddy's unit, battered but alive, waiting by the rendezvous point. Against every odds, they'd made it back. When the convoys finally reunited, the scene was one of quiet disbelief. Men embraced without words, their faces streaked with dust and relief. They shared the last of their water, each sip a victory of its own. That night, under a blanket of stars, Stirling gathered them around the fading embers of a fire. "We did what we came to do," he said softly. "The Luftwaffe won't forget this night. And neither will we." His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. They had accomplished the impossible, proving that a handful of men could shake an empire. Yet even as they rested, they knew this was only the beginning. The desert had tested them, scarred them, and made them something more than soldiers. It had made them brothers, bound not by rank or uniform, but by the shared memory of fire and sand. When the surviving jeeps rolled back into British lines, no one quite believed what they'd done. 18 jeeps had driven into the heart of the German war machine and returned, battered, dust-covered, and triumphant. News of the raid spread like wildfire through the camps. Pilots, infantrymen, mechanics, everyone wanted to hear how a handful of men had turned a Luftwaffe airfield into a furnace. Stirling, gaunt from exhaustion, said little. He wasn't a man who craved the spotlight. He just wanted his men fed, their dead remembered, and the record set straight. This wasn't luck, it was proof. Proof that the future of warfare belonged not to vast armies, but to the daring few who moved in the shadows. "We are not soldiers in the traditional sense," he once told them. "We are hunters." And that night, in the middle of the desert, they had hunted and won. Back in Cairo, the higher-ups were stunned. Intelligence reports confirmed the scale of destruction. Dozens of enemy aircraft wiped out, supplies ruined, morale shattered. For the British command, this was more than a daring mission. It was a revelation. Stirling was summoned, not to be reprimanded this time, but to be decorated. He received the Distinguished Service Order and later the Order of the British Empire. But for all the medals and ceremony, Stirling knew the real victory lay elsewhere, in the formation of a new kind of soldier, a brotherhood forged not in barracks or drills, but in the crucible of the desert. From that moment on, L Detachment would have a new name, the Special Air Service. And with that name came a creed that would echo through generations: who dares wins. Yet the glory was not without its ghosts. The men still spoke of John Robson, the young trooper who never made it home, and of Andre Zirnheld, the French poet who'd faced death with serenity and courage. Stirling often carried a copy of Zernheld's Paratrooper's Prayer, a quiet tribute to his fallen comrade. In the months that followed, the SAS would continue their raids, hitting convoys, supply dumps, and airfields all across North Africa. Each mission carried the same DNA: speed, surprise, and absolute audacity. And as word spread, even the Germans began to fear the unseen, whispering about the ghosts of the desert who appeared out of nowhere and vanished before dawn. The SAS had become more than a unit. They were a myth in motion. Years later, when the war finally ended, many of the surviving men would look back on that night, the flames, the gunfire, the impossible odds, and realize they'd witnessed the birth of something timeless. The world had changed, and so had warfare. From the jungles of Borneo to the streets of Baghdad, from hostage rescues to counterterrorism missions, the shadow of that first desert raid still lingers. The SAS proved that courage, cunning, and sheer will could overcome even the strongest enemy. And somewhere in that memory, in the glow of burning aircraft and the whisper of desert wind, you can almost hear Stirling's voice once more. Calm, steady, resolute. Who dares, wins.